You have a 36-year career in public service, a lot of it at Department of Defense, now at Department of Commerce, and I'll just read a little bit of your bio. You have been awarded 3 Department of Defense Distinguished Public Service Medals, the Distinguished Civil Service Medal, 2 Presidential Rank Service Awards, and the Service to America Medal for National Security. You're also, I thought this was amazing, the first career federal official to hold the position of Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Material Readiness. So we plan to court you to help plan the next Silverado Summit here next year. But Alan, in all seriousness, we at Silverado released a report in January looking at the issue of how Russia is responding to the export control measures that the administration has put in, and your agency, BIS, is at the front and center of this. I know you know about this report because we shared it with your team. And what we found is that there's a lot of evasion that's taking place, including through countries in Central Asia, like Kazakhstan and Turkey. And I thought it was remarkable to see a news story, or several news stories in the last few days, saying that Turkey and Kazakhstan are actually starting to crack down on transshipments of chips and other critical goods that Russia needs to sustain its war efforts. Can you talk a little bit about the efforts that BIS is taking on this issue of enforcing our export controls, because your agency really is at the front lines of this effort, this critical tool of national security that we're now using, both Russia, China, and others?
Well, first of all, Dmitri, thank you for inviting me. If I had known you were an ace debater, I might not have agreed to have done this. But I am happy to be up here to chat about what we in BIS, what we in Commerce at large, and frankly across the federal government, and looking wider with our allies, are doing about Russia. For those of you who don't track what BIS does, I'm really in the export control business, a few other things around the industrial base that we also do. With regard to Russia, as you know, we put on massive export controls starting on February 24th, and we've put about 10 rules plus since that time, working with 38 other nations around the world in doing this, 37 other nations plus us. On the evasion question, in all due respect, your report didn't tell me that evasion was going on. It did help shine a light on it, and we appreciate it, quite frankly, and I told you that. But Russia has a long history of learning how to do this. All they have to do is break out their old Cold War playbook on how they were doing those things. So what we have been doing, and I'm happy to say I've talked to my counterparts in the European Union and every customs official across the European Union just on Friday on this point. We're looking at what I'll call oddities in trade. So trade in certain goods going to Turkey, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, that were not going on before. We're looking at what companies those goods are going to, many of which didn't exist until after February 24th. And then we're looking at what companies in the US and the EU are propagating those shipments. And we have a robust international travel schedule. I had my Assistant Secretary, Tay Kendler, was in Turkey in December, leading up to the stoppage of movement through their free trade zone. That's a good thing. That's not sufficient for the end game, but it's a good thing, and for EU goods going through that trade zone too. And I'll also note that Turkey has stopped servicing Russian and Belarusian airplanes that transit Turkish airports. So again, stop cargo flow. So we have to go out, we have to talk to the countries, we have to talk to the companies, and if the countries don't do something about the companies, I have this little thing called the entity list that I'm more than happy to put a couple of companies on. But we want to get it right, and we do want to give the countries a chance. Most of them do not really want to be complicit in the flow, but some of the flows are like, 2,000% increase in laptops, and then 4,000% increase of that good going to Russia that didn't exist before. And so we are all over that.
That's fantastic. I do want to mention there's a great chart in our report that shows exports of iPhones and other smartphones to Russia. from Armenia. You might not know that Armenia is a massive exporter of smartphones. Well, they weren't before February 22nd. But can you talk to us a little bit about BIS? Because as I mentioned, this agency truly is now for export controls. And the agency has to change with the times. When we were meeting a few months ago, you were telling me that at DoD you had a budget, a discretionary budget, I think, that was much larger than the budget of your entire agency. So how are you dealing with this challenge with the resources that you do have? And I know that Congress has allocated some more resources to you. And how are you reforming the agency to meet this new critical national security priority?
So a couple of things there, and I would thank you for that question. BIS, as you note, Bureau of Industry and Security, has become a central point in protecting technology. You know, I've walked around calling myself the Chief Technology Protection Officer of the United States, for whatever that means. But essentially stopping our technology from going to our adversaries, where our adversaries can use it to build things to be used against us. And, you know, it's not just me that has come to the realization that BIS plays a key role here. I could quote Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, who pointed out that targeted use of export controls can be a game changer and can actually help decrease military capability of our adversaries. And that's what you're seeing in Russia, quite frankly. The fact that they have to export or import an iPhone or a laptop to get the chip shows that the regular ways of getting chips aren't working. And frankly, they're not getting the highest end chips that you would need to put in a seeker if you want to take out a HIMARS battery. You can certainly bomb a hospital or a maternity ward. I mean, you're seeing that, unfortunately, on the backs of the Ukrainian people. But so it's a mind shift, and it's a mind shift related to Russia, and obviously it's a mind shift related to what we're doing around China. And, you know, again, the entity list is a nice tool. The entity list is not a blacklist. It's actually a licensing strategy. But, you know, what we did in October is, instead of playing whack-a-mole with different companies, we took out a sector. Right? And it's not that we stopped the Chinese from being able to develop chips. We stopped the highest end chips. And not only the chip side of it, you know, the production, but the use of those chips for AI and artificial intelligence, which they're using for weapon systems and they're using for the suppression of their people. So it's a real mind shift. Now, resources, I could absolutely use more resources to do this, but I have a great team and we're going to manage with what we can. And on the enforcement side, it's not just BIS and my 200 or so enforcement agents. It's me and the entire IC, the intelligence community. It's HSI, it's FBI, it's our counterparts in other nations. So it's all as one team.
So to that point, there was an announcement a few weeks ago from the Department of Justice about this Disruptive Technologies Task Force that BIS obviously is a critical member of, HSI, FBI, agency mentions. What is the point of that task force? What are you trying to achieve with that?
Also, you know, this goes back to the original question, what's going on in evasion? And so we're looking at, first let me back up, the fact that Lisa Monaco stood up this task force in conjunction with us. It's just a fabulous thing. So we have assistant U.S. attorneys engaged in 12 different points. Happen to be places where I have export control officers also engaged who know how to do the export analysis type work. And it's getting after evasion, and not just for Russia. It's you know, the Chinese are also working on evasion strategies, and why wouldn't they be? So we have to get on top of that. And I always want to be 2 steps ahead, and this strike force is a way of doing that.
So we have a lot of industry here, a lot of major companies. What is your message for them of how you would like to better partner with them on addressing these issues? What are the challenges you guys have at BIS where industry can lend a helping hand?
So let me step back and talk from the Department of Commerce's perspective, where we believe in promoting trade and promoting U.S. industry in the Department of Commerce, except for my little part of the Department of Commerce where I seem to be the black hat bad guy who comes and says, well, okay, that's a really cool thing that you made, but you can't sell it here. And I realize that I'm impacting revenue when we do that. So we want to do that in a targeted way. We do want to promote where we can, and Secretary Raimondo made a speech last November about China policy. And essentially, my shorthand version of that is promote what we can, protect what we must. And we are going to protect what we must for a national security perspective. And we're going to work with companies when we do that. I don't want to surprise companies when we do that. And we'll try to explain why we are doing what we're doing. And frankly, some of those markets, while they may, Russia for the United States was not that important of export point. China obviously is a different perspective. But frankly, some of those markets are going to migrate to other places, not just because of what we're doing, because that's not the point of what we're doing. We're really just trying to protect national security. But if you look at the supply chain issues that impacted during COVID, followed up with Ukraine, and if you're not a company that's thinking about diversification of your supply chain, you should be. Let me leave it at that.
Anything you would like them to do better on in terms of their export control measures? It strikes me that when the Treasury Department started implementing sanctions on Iran, a lot of companies were surprised by that. You saw some enforcement actions being taken against banks in Europe and elsewhere that weren't complying with that. Are you seeing that the industry is realizing that they need to do a much better job of looking at the entities list, applying for licenses when it's appropriate? Are you seeing that mind shift in the industry?
For the most part, yes. I think, for the major companies represented in this room, they have pretty good compliance record. There's always going to be a stub toe here and there. And you have to say, okay, why did that happen? Fix it and move on. For people who are evading purposefully, that's a different story, and we will take either administrative or criminal action. And you're going to see some cases on that coming up as well. Not that I can talk about investigations here. But I think for the most part, companies are paying attention. And we have an outreach program that if they're not sure about whether something is exportable to a given entity, we're happy to walk them through that process.
Let's talk a little bit about China. You mentioned these really incredible export control measures that the administration has put on some chips companies, particularly equipment manufacturing companies, that were supplying equipment to China to help produce them with these advanced chips. What is the end strategy here in terms of what you're trying to achieve? You mentioned AI. Is this all about preventing China from developing these advanced AI applications for their weapons industry?
As you noted in my bio, I spent a long career at the Department of Defense, both in, was the Assistant Secretary for Logistics, the Deputy Undersecretary for Acquisition Technology and Logistics. It's the #2 acquisition official in the department. So I have a pretty good handle on how we were building weapon systems and what we were doing. It's 5 years dated, but I happen to know the people who are still doing that. So it should be no surprise that the Chinese are trying to develop, modernize their weapons capability as we are. AI is going to be a tool for command and control, for rapid decision making, for logistics. Logistics across the Pacific, one of my nightmares is it's a PhD 404 level class on how you're going to deploy and resupply a force in a China scenario. Go out and break out your World War II books and start reading, and then turn up the dial a lot. So it should be no surprise that the Chinese are trying to do likewise, and they're developing weapon systems designed to defeat our weapon systems and to defeat our capabilities. Fine, you just can't do that with Western technology.
It reminds me that when you look at the Cold War with the Soviet Union, in the 1920s and 30s, you had massive number of entrepreneurs, American entrepreneurs, going to the Soviet Union, helping build the industrial base. In fact, if you remember the fight over Mariupol and the Azovstal metallurgical facility last year, that was a site that was actually based on the designs of a similar site in Gary, Indiana, that the Soviets didn't steal, but had Americans come over in the 20s and 30s and help build the industry that then we started confronting in the Cold War. Alan, one last question. This is a fight for the future is the theme of our conference, but we can't fight for the future without allies. Talk to us a little bit about your engagements, not just with the European unions, but with allies around the world, to get them to understand why it's important to prevent adversary nations that present a major threat to national security of not just America, but our allies, to engage in this effort? And how are you convincing them that they should be cutting off their own industry, just like as we are doing ourselves for Russia, for China, Iran, North Korea, and prevent these technologies from going to these places?
Well, we're very fortunate as a nation in that we have allies, and we pretty much have the same allies at the core that we've had since the end of World War II and the reshaping of the international order that we did together with those allies, and follow up the rebuild of Japan and the rebuild of Germany. Those allies share our values. They're democratic nations with our values. And they understand the same threats. So frankly, my way of going out and talking to them is to start there and say, here's what they're doing. You know it. We know it. If you talk about Asia, they're within that range of those little missiles. And we have forces there, too, on top of that. And they have the same tussles. And obviously, Europe has seen the worst fighting since World War II. So they're not that difficult. Now, what they want assurances from us is that we're not doing this purely to promote the United States companies and economy at their expense, that this is truly a national security point. And frankly, when I've been having those discussions with them, that happens pretty rapidly in those discussions. And so it's not a threatening posture with our allies. It's not a coercive posture. We're allies for a reason. And the nations that we're talking about, little pariah nation alliance that they're building together, they'll never have the same fortitude, same underpinning that we will with our allies. And it's good to have friends.
We'll end it on that note. Alan, thank you so much for your service to the nation, for the really important work that you and your agency are doing on these critical national security issues.
Right. Thank you for hosting this, Dmitri.